Okay. Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all this Lord's Day. We are excited to be with you, and I will be endeavoring to use a PowerPoint this morning, and so we'll see how that goes. I've used them many times in the past, but our technology at Philadelphia is a little dated, and so I don't use them much. And so I thought the Bible class would be the most appropriate time to use one. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. If you would turn to Matthew 7 and verse 12. I like participation in classes, and so I will call on individuals to read, not personally, but just I will invite or ask if anyone would like to read. But so we'll start that way this morning. Matthew 7 and verse 12. If someone would like to read that for us. Matthew 7 and verse 12. When we think about this particular rule, the golden rule as we call it, we usually summarize it by saying what? Do unto others as you would have them do to you, or treat others the way you want to be treated. This rule is called the golden rule. Why? Think about that for a moment. Why is this called the golden rule? Yeah, could potentially solve a lot of problems, right?
It's the highest standard.
Okay, it's the highest standard. Right. Let's look at a couple of examples here in just a moment. Let's think about what this law is not first. How many of us have heard of the iron rule? The iron rule. Do unto others what you have the power to do. This is the principle or the concept of might makes right. Now, as we think about our world and the history of our world, what are some examples that come to mind? Might makes right. I will do to others what I have the power or the ability to do. I think about some of the ancient kingdoms of biblical history when I think about this particular rule. Nations that conquer other nations because they have the power and the ability to do it without any consideration at all for the people that they are conquering. Iron rule. Rome, Greece, others come to mind, of course. A couple of examples there. This was the way of Cain. This was the way, of course, of other biblical examples that we could no doubt contemplate, and people of secular history as well, as we've mentioned a couple. What about the brass rule? The brass rule, often stated as do unto others as they do unto you. This might be the concept or the principle of eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. You ever heard someone say that? Well, an eye for an eye. And many times they're quoting the Old Testament, not understanding the way that those particular laws in the Old Testament were to be implemented. In my estimation, those laws were not to be implemented by the individual towards another, but that they were laws that were meant in the intention of that at least to prevent crime. In other words, if you committed a crime under the law, then you would receive a just punishment for the crime you committed. Not this idea, this person, did this to me and therefore I'm going to do the same to him. It was not for people to take into their own hands, but for judges or magistrates to settle under the law. Brass rule. And then the silver rule. This has been stated in a number of ways, and it's a good rule if you think about it. But it comes up just a little bit short. Whatever is hateful to you, do not do to another. Whatever is hateful to you, do not do to another. This law is on the surface a good law, but it is a negative law. It is a negative law. We're going to expand on that here in just a moment. Hillel was a rabbi, and he is recorded as saying to a man that wished to proselyte and asked him to teach him the whole law by saying the following: whatever is hateful to you, do not do to another. So notice the negative nature of it. Whatever is hateful to you, do not do to another. Socrates, Buddha, Confucius, and Hillel, as we've mentioned, each had some form of this particular law. Do not do to others what you would not have done to you. This is from Brother McGarvey, notice, stating it makes it a rule of not doing rather than a rule of doing. Compare that now to the golden rule which we mentioned a moment ago, Matthew 7:12. Do unto others. Do. We say sometimes Christianity is a religion of what? Action. A religion of doing, not a religion of not doing. And so we want to think about this statement or this verse for just a few minutes this morning. Let's think about the source of this law. Who gave it? The golden rule. In the midst of a world wherein you find all of these rules implemented by individuals and or kingdoms, Jesus comes into the world and begins to teach something that's a little bit different. Something that is higher by way of its standard. Really something that summarizes the law and the prophets. This is the law, Jesus would say, and the prophets. What is? This concept that he presents to his followers. And it has to do with what? Think about this law. This law teaches us what? Ultimately, it teaches us how we are to treat people. It teaches us how we are to interact with people. And that's what Christianity really and truly is all about. It is important that we understand how to worship our God and that we be doctrinally sound. But those are not the identifying marks of the Lord's people. The identifying marks of the Lord's people should be how we treat others, the world in which we live. And so this is a very important study for those reasons. Jesus says, this is the law and the prophets. Quoting from Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, several verses there you can see you like to jot down. We will, for time's sake, not address every verse in these slides. This was a lengthy PowerPoint presentation, but listen to this statement. All divine law, whether of Moses and the prophets, of Christ or the apostles, is fulfilled by love. For those things that the law requires are the natural, normal acts of a loving heart. Love is that which finds its felicity in another's good. Another has defined it as love is holiness spelt short. Well, maybe that's a good way of thinking of that. Here we go. 1 John 4, 7 and 8. Let's turn over there and read from that particular passage. 1 John 4, 7 and 8. If someone wouldn't mind, read that verse or those verses. Sometimes in our youth programs, our children even sing a song based on these verses. But what do we learn here about God? Many of you can tell me without reading the verses, but what do we learn about God in those two verses? God is love. It's His very nature and character. God is love. And His commandments. What is the purpose of the commandments that God has given? Well, we might say to instruct us in how we are to live, to teach us how to worship. Both of those statements would be true. Both of those, I think neither of those really reaches to the depth that they should, or we should be considering. What God has provided through Christ is for our salvation, our hope. The objective of that, however, is, oftentimes we say, to go where? God saved us, and He wants us to be where in the end? He wants us to go to heaven. And that would be 100% true. But let's think about that area in between salvation and heaven. What's that to look like? What God has provided through His Word, through His commandments, through the new law or the new covenant, is that which is needed for us to learn to love as God has loved. As Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 13, it is the more excellent way. Now we're going to make application based on the first few verses there of 1 Corinthians 13. We often skip over those to get to those descriptive words that describe what love is. Charity suffereth long and is kind, and so on. But in the first 4 verses, Paul establishes a principle that's vital. It is the case that I could worship the Lord every Lord's Day. I could be involved in the acts of a local congregation, the works of a local congregation. It is the case that I could be at every gospel meeting, be engaged in benevolent works of various kinds, and still my soul be lost in the end. Why? Because as Paul describes for us, love must be the motive from which every action springs. And so God has given us this law, His commandments. He has provided the Christ for us for a specific reason. And that reason is that this system, with its worship, with what He teaches, is designed to create within us a character that looks just like Jesus. The church, therefore, with Christ as the head over His body, must represent Jesus. It must look like Him in everything that it does. That's a good test for the church, in my estimation, incidentally. Not so much, though it's important, not so much are we worshiping the right way? Are we doing the right things? Not so much how many works we have going in the various aspects of the work of the church. But do we, in doing those things, look like Jesus? So we at times simply need to reflect on the life of Jesus. Look at his work. Look at the time he spent on this earth. Look at what he was doing and how he did it, and then ask ourselves, as the body of Christ, do we look like that? We are his body, meaning we are his hands, we are his feet, we are the mode through which he operates in the world. You've heard the statement, people don't care how much you know until what? And so if we don't reflect that in the things that we do, then we're not going to reach people. They don't care about what we know. To be honest with you today. In today's world, in particular the religious climate in which we live, that's a very difficult conversation to have. But people do see Christ. They do see when a congregation loves and when it demonstrates that love through the way that it worships. When it demonstrates that love through the works in which it is engaged, whether that's benevolence or evangelism or whatever it may be. Love is the more excellent way. Everything that God requires, under both covenants, incidentally, everything that he requires has that objective as its end. And so we must learn to love. This rule is established and based in that very principle. Barnes states the following in regards to this statement that love works no ill toward his neighbor. How many schemes would it crush? It would silence the voice of the slanderer. It would stay the plans of the seducer and the adulterer. It would put an end to cheating and fraud and all schemes of dishonest gain. The gambler desires the property of his neighbor without any compensation and thus works ill to him. The dealer in lotteries desires property for which he has never toiled and which must be obtained at the expense and loss of others, and there are many employments, all whose tendency is to work ill to a neighbor. And so Barnes describes there this very concept. The source of this rule is of course, God. Jesus, in essence, summarizes what is all the law and the prophets. Here it is. Here's what I wanted you to know through those laws that I gave you, through the prophets that spoke to you. Here's what I want you to know. And with that understanding, there is a service that comes as a result. Do ye even so unto them. The Christian religion is, as we have stated, a religion of doing. We must be active and not passive. In Matthew 7:24, we find a passage that sometimes we use to teach our children in the form of a song. And the wise man built his house upon the rock. The foolish man built his house upon the sands, But that's not just a children's song. The principles of that are vitally important. Whoever hears these sayings, Jesus says, and does them. You'll notice that these verses are from the King James. That's what I still use to this day. It's what I learned in school, memory work. The Bible that I've had for so long is the King James. I use a bunch of others. And so I'm not stuck with one version, so to speak, but I like it for this reason. Whoever heareth and doeth, and the writers were trying to portray something to us. Whoever continues to hear and whoever continues to do is like that wise man. And he built his house upon the rock. And that's what stood the test of time. James would write in James 1:22 that we are to be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving our own selves. In other words, if we are hearers of the word, and I love to hear the truth preached, just like anyone else. I don't like when things that are false are taught or preached. Love to hear the truth. And I think everyone in here would agree with that. But do we love to do as much as we love to hear? That's a different question altogether. Because, well, we struggle sometimes. Various ways, different circumstances. But sometimes we don't like to do as much as we like to hear. Because doing requires what? Think about it with me. To be a doer means I have to hear. I take in the information, I learn what God wants from me, I learn what He asks me to do, and then what next? I have to do it. Now, I could do it in one of two ways. As we've mentioned already, I could do it and my heart and my motive not be right and that not profit me anything. I could also do it because my motive and my heart is right and then that be profitable. But that requires something. You see, this book will require us to change. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. It requires us to change, to mold our will, we say sometimes, to the will of God. Not my will, as Jesus prayed, but thine be done. And there's a process involved there. This carries us beyond the love of sentiment to a love that is seen in action. It's kind of like the example of James, in James 2, where there was a brother who was in need, and the response comes, go on your way, be warmed and filled. Well, there was no action. This is a love in this verse that teaches us to go beyond. One commentator has stated, we know how we should like to be treated under certain circumstances. Accordingly, we see how others would also wish to be treated. And so this is a rule or a law that requires some contemplation, some thinking on our behalf, on our part. He would go on, instead of letting self-interest blind us to our duty to others, we may use the voice of self-interest as the very indicator of what should be done to them. It requires us to put ourselves in the shoes of others, to place ourselves in their circumstances, and to act based on what we would want to be done to us in that situation. Christianity is a religion of doing. It is also a religion of thinking. And so we must be willing to act in those ways. Let's look at the standard. Ye would that men should do to you. Brother McGarvey said it teaches us to put ourselves in our neighbor's place, direct our conduct accordingly. It assumes, of course, that when we put ourselves in our neighbor's place, we are wise enough not to make any foolish wishes and good enough not to make any evil ones. Remember, the motive here is what? It's love. And so, Milliken stated or listed the idea of the golden rule as first among those ideas that stand out above all others in the influence they have exerted upon and are destined to exert upon the development of the human race. How do we make a difference in our community? Well, let's back up. How do we make a difference in our home? We live by the golden rule. How do we make a difference in our communities? We live according to the golden rule. How do we make a difference in the churches where we live according to the golden rule? Its standard is godly in nature. Another has stated here, this is from College Press, Jesus demands positive social action. He has no use for that self-complacency, which is harmless, negative goodness that does nothing wrong, but never does any good either. I think for a long time in the Lord's church, we have focused on a lot of the negative and not a whole lot on the good. We teach our children, we teach those that we have opportunities to teach, not all circumstances and places, but in a lot that I've seen. We don't do this, we don't do this, we don't do this in worship, we don't do this in our conduct, we don't do these things or go these places. We don't. But how often do we hear on, here's what we should do, here's what we should be. These are the things in which we should be engaged as the Lord's people. Has to be balanced there, just like any other area. He goes on to say, to Jesus, omission to be helpful is sin. Jesus can acknowledge no ethic as genuine that does not inspire a man to be useful or of positive benefit to his fellows. Therefore, Jesus' positive dictum commissions us to do what? To get busy. This is the law and the prophets. This is the golden rule. Let's look at the scope. The golden rule is golden. Why? Because of its value. This, if you were to summarize Christianity, this verse would do it. This would do it. It is a rule, a standard by which we live, because it is a summary of what Christian living should be. Think about the areas of life that could be affected by the golden rule. Relationships, all of them. In the home, within the church, in the world. We could expand that further under each of those categories. So let's look quickly at what the golden rule will do. It will see to the needs of the poor and less fortunate. Jesus was compassionate. One verse that has always struck me is Matthew 9:36, and I'll admit, honestly, I strive to be this way, though I fall very, very, very short. Jesus was moved with compassion on the multitudes when he saw their condition, when he saw their needs. Moved with compassion. And this is really, it's defined as feeling what another feels. It's an outgrowth, of course, of love. But it's something that comes from deep within. You see someone who's sick and hurting, and you're moved. You feel it. Literally, this word carries the idea of feeling movement in the bowels. The Jews thought that the bowels were the seat of emotion. Compassion is that which moves you from within. You feel it in your soul. Jesus was moved with compassion toward the lost, toward the sick, toward the hurting. And so must we be. I've long believed that when we as the body of Christ as a whole learn how to be compassionate the way Jesus was compassionate, we will have more opportunities to study with people than we ever imagined. A couple of verses there that remind us, of course, of what we should be doing. Galatians 6:10, 2 Corinthians 9. Other passages teach us and show us or remind us of what we are to be doing. And that's taking care of the poor and the less fortunate. It will preach the gospel to the lost. Of course, there are several passages that commission us to do this. But just think about each of these as we apply the golden rule to them. If I were lost and destined for hell, what would I want a Christian to do for me? We sing a song about it sometimes. You never mentioned him to me. And it's designed to get us to thinking and to convict our hearts. There are people who are lost and they need to know the gospel and the truth of the gospel and what Christ did to save them. Well, the golden rule will help us to do that. The golden rule will help us to reclaim the backslider. How many members here have gone astray? You know, you can ask this question everywhere, and there's always a big number. People who are no longer here. Why? Well, we don't know all the reasons. And sometimes our efforts to reclaim them don't go very well, but the golden rule will drive that. Galatians 6 and verse 1. You which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself. So we have the responsibility to save that soul from death, to hide the multitude of sins, James 5:19 and 20. We must reclaim them. Strive to reclaim them. The golden rule will help us to accomplish that. It will cause my speech to be seasoned with grace. That's the 5-minute bell, right? It will cause my speech to be seasoned with grace. Colossians 4 and verse 6. I don't know if it's the fact that we get comfortable with one another, but sometimes in the Lord's church, you will find people that will say things to you or to others that are sometimes, I guess, just hateful, mean, ugly. You've seen examples of that throughout your Christian life. Golden rule will put an end to that. It will promote forgiveness. What do I want from a brother or sister in times of sin? Will drive me and cause me to go to them. As the Bible teaches, Matthew 18, that's conflict resolution, right? That's the great chapter on how we resolve our differences and our conflicts. And so the Bible teaches us to go to one another and resolve those issues in this spirit. I suppose the things that it will do or accomplish are many more than what we've talked about in this particular class. Those are just a few of the things that the golden rule will do. And so as we close, thinking about this wonderful rule, Matthew 7 and verse 12, it is the golden rule. There is no area of life for the Christian that is not touched by this rule. It's golden because it comes from the highest standard that man can know, and that is God. And so we have a challenge before us. What I would encourage each of us to do is to basically just look at our lives and ask a very simple question. When I measure my life according to the golden rule, how do I measure up? What does that look like for me? How am I doing in that area? I don't know about you, but that challenges me. And so, any questions or comments before we bring this to a close? Appreciate your attention and reading, and hope that has been of some benefit to you in this study. Thank you.